Welcome to part 4 of a 5-part tutorial for learning how to batch load groundwater locations to the Ecology EIM system. So we're starting to move into some of the fields that use codes that you might not recognize. The valid value lookup worksheet here has all the codes, but it doesn't provide an explanation of what the codes mean. So if you want to clarify what each one of the codes are, you can go to the help documentation on the second worksheet, and it'll explain the valid values. In the case of this column, horizontal coordinates represent, you can always default groundwater locations to a value of 24 since they're discrete monitoring points. You need to report your X and Y coordinates relative to one of the major allowed horizontal datums. Ecology prefers that you report in the NAD 83 Harn horizontal datum, but there are several other choices. In this example here, the appropriate X and Y metadata codes have already been copied directly from the EIM map service CSV file, where I determine my X and Y coordinates using the map tools. In contrast, I've used the help documentation to figure out the appropriate codes to input for surveyed locations. We do suggest that the EIM map service will probably supply you a more accurate XY location than a paper map, so I've left this field blank. You want to describe what the elevation of the groundwater location is referencing to. There are three choices: the land surface, the top of the well casing, or a defined measuring point on that casing. In most cases, monitoring wells are surveyed to a reference point that's at the top of the well casing with the well cap removed, so that's what I've input for this well set. In this case, where I've derived the elevation from the EIM map service, the land surface is the appropriate code for this column. Here, the surveyed elevations are entered for this example. In this case, I've just copied the elevations from the EIM map service CSV file. Again, I use the help documentation to fill out the appropriate codes for the datum and accuracy and collection method for the surveyed elevations. These codes for this example have been copied directly from the CSV file. Obviously, marine elevation doesn't apply to groundwater locations. You need to supply water level measuring point information for each well that you submit to the EIM system. In this first example, the top of the well casing is used as the measuring point for each one of the wells, so I input TOC1 as the measuring point ID in each case. I assign a number to the ID so that if the vertical position of the top of the casing ever changes, for example if the casing's ever cut, I can establish a second measuring point ID, which I would then call TOC2. External data submitters need to work with an Ecology EIM data coordinator if you ever need to add a second measuring point for a well. Ecology staff can do this themselves within the well editor. I also enter a description of the measuring point. For monitoring wells, this is often a mark or a notch on the north side of the well casing. In the second example, there are a variety of water level measuring points that were used, so I enter an appropriate ID and text description. You'll notice that I leave these fields blank for the spring since this information doesn't apply. I also need to supply information about the height of the measuring point above land surface for each well. In the case of resource protection wells, the measuring point height is also known in the business as the well casing stick-up. Providing measuring point height information allows the EIM system to take all water level results that are submitted in terms of depths below a measuring point, TOC or otherwise, and recalculate them in terms of water levels as depths below land surface. Similar to normalizing all water levels in terms of a common elevation datum, normalizing all water levels as depths below land surface allows future data users to map depth to water from location to location. If you know the date when the water level measuring point was first used, enter the value in this column. This can be helpful later when trying to match water levels against a specific measuring point in cases where there are multiple measuring points that have been recorded for a well. A more detailed explanation about the water level measuring point concept is presented in the tutorial that demonstrates how to load discrete water level measurements to EIM. So if you need more information, I recommend that you watch that tutorial. In the well tag ID field, go ahead and fill in the well tag ID. Ecology strongly encourages that you tag and identify all of your wells with a unique tag ID. Eventually we'll probably be requiring all wells entered into the EIM system to use that system. If you have information about the ownership for the well, go ahead and enter it into these fields here. In this next field, I'm going to assign a groundwater location type to each location. I can use the help documentation to select the appropriate value for each one of the locations. In the first example, all of the wells are assigned as monitoring wells, but in the second example, I've assigned a variety of location types, including irrigation wells, public supply wells, piezometers, and springs. Let's move on to entering some basic information about the construction details for each one of the wells. Although the EIM system has the ability to link a well location to a specific well log in the Water Resources Program well log database, we require you to enter some basic information about the well depth and well open interval. Having this information in the EIM system allows users the ability to search for groundwater monitoring data using specific criteria regarding the vertical position in the subsurface that the monitoring measurements were collected from. In columns BA and BB, I've entered information about the total depth of the well. I've also selected the appropriate valid value from the help documentation to describe the type of open interval for the well. I use columns BD through BF to enter information about the vertical position of the top and the bottom of the open interval. If for some reason you're working with a well that you don't have open interval information for, enter unknown in the well completion type field and leave the upper and lower interval depth field blanks. In the case of an open-ended well casing, where there is no vertical dimension to the open interval, simply enter the same value in both the upper and lower depth fields. There are certainly some cases where wells might have multiple open intervals separated by cased intervals, particularly for deep water supply wells in the basalts of eastern Washington. In this case, we recommend that you assign the upper and lower open interval values to correspond with the uppermost and lowermost positions of the combined open intervals. You can enter additional information about the well construction in columns BG through BL. After you've uploaded your location template to EIM, you should try to establish a link between each one of the wells that you've entered in a well log in the well log database. If you're an Ecology staff member, you can do this yourself in the well editor. If you're an external data submitter, you'll need to work with your Ecology project manager to build those links. So we're down to the last 3 fields of the location spreadsheet. This field is your opportunity to specifically flag a well as the upgradient well for a facility or site. This is intended to identify wells that are defined as upgradient or background for regulatory or compliance purposes. For example, a background compliance well designated in a water quality program permit. If you enter a yes for any well, you have to provide a facility site database ID for that facility in the facility site ID column that's earlier in this spreadsheet. If there's a published aquifer test report for a well, you can flag the aquifer test column Y for yes. Well log specific capacity or bail down tests don't count, only tests that are supported by a published technical report of some sort. If you're an external data submitter, you can work with your Ecology project manager or EIM data coordinator to add a reference to that report in the EIM study bibliography. And if the well is naturally flowing, you can flag the final column with a Y.